Hello, this is Rabbi Dr. Juan Marcos Berrona Gutierrez, and today I wanted to talk about one of my other books that I've written. It's titled, Why Did Spanish Jews Convert to Christianity? And for those of you who are familiar with the work, some of the work that I do, it specifically focuses on the topic of anusim, of forced converts to Christianity in the late 14th century, and then continuing throughout the 15th century in Castile and Aragon in the Iberian Peninsula. And of course, my major works are Secret Jews, the complex identity of crypto-Jews and crypto-Judaism, as well as the Inquisition, or the rise of the Inquisition. And I have other books that are related to that. The reason that I wrote this specific book, and it's been out for a while, there's a Kindle version as well as the paperback version, is that one of the things that I've seen in academic discussions, and even in lay discussions on the question of anusim, b'nai anusim, crypto-Jews, etc., is that there's often an assumption about why Spanish and Portuguese Jews converted to Christianity. And a common view has been that they were less committed to Judaism than, let's say, their Ashkenazic compatriots were. And the comparison that's always made is the pogroms, the attacks on the Jewish communities in the Rhineland that occurred during the Crusader periods of the medieval period. What happens, however, is that if we study something like Sefer Hasidim, other works by Rabbi Yehuda HaHasid, what we find is that the phenomena of crypto-Judaism was not simply an Iberian response. But the difference, though, is that the numbers between the Jewish communities in the Iberian Peninsula and those in the lands of Ashkenaz were very different. The communities of the Iberian Peninsula were very large. In 1391, 80 Jewish communities were attacked. So it just gives you sort of an idea of how extensive and how large the Jewish community was. In any case, to the topic of why did they convert, I think it's very complex. There's not just one reason. I think many people converted because they were trying to avoid the violence, which is, I think, pretty obvious. But I think there were other reasons as well that have to be taken into consideration. And I think that they haven't necessarily been explored as extensively as I would have liked. And there's always been this assumption that, again, that Jews in the Iberian Peninsula were not as committed religiously. I think their perspective on conversion was different because their environment was very different. And we have to look at, for example, the question of Islam and its influence on the Spanish, if you will, to use that term broadly, the Spanish Jewish mindset. And what I mean by that is that Jews living in the lands of France and Germany, their experience was very different because they were the only minority group within the context of Christianity, the Christian kingdoms. In Spain, in Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, Jews were one of several groups. Of course, there were Old Christians, there were Muslims, and of course there were Jews. Those were the three major groups. Islam's influence on Judaism was profound. If we look at the great Jewish philosophers of the medieval period, and of course with the apogee of the Rambam, these individuals, Solomon ibn Gabirol, Yehuda Halevi, all these individuals were influenced to some extent by their experience with Islam, and many of the great philosophical works were written in Arabic. And so one of the things that I argue, and it's not something I think revolutionary, I think it makes sense, is that the concept of taqiyya, the concept of dissimulation, was something that was transferred or assimilated by the Jewish community from Islamic perspectives on it. Because in Islam, in contrast to certainly medieval Christianity, the idea of martyrdom for one's faith is very different. Martyrdom in Islam, in the classic tradition, was in the midst of a battle, right? We think about jihad and so forth, but this idea of fighting for the cause and dying in the midst of battle. There isn't really the sense that, being slaughtered for one's faith, there's not really a lot of what would be admiration for that. And I think sometimes when we look at cases in Ashkenaz and the Rhineland and so forth, there seems to be sort of this glorification of martyrdom as the Jewish response to persecution. And I think it's certainly one response, but it wasn't the only response. And I think a lot of Jews saw in Islam and its approach to faith, how when they were confronted with Christian armies and Christian persecution, when they were not in control, they could respond in such a way to take advantage of the situation for their own good. I mean, that is to say that if they were not in a position to be victorious, dissimulation was certainly an option. And I think you see that to some extent in the Rambam's writing when he discusses the case of individuals who had converted to Islam under the Almohades, in the 12th and into the 13th century, the 1100s, and then I think to the early period. I'm sorry, of the 13th century. So in any case, the idea here is that that's one issue to consider. Another thing to consider is the question of Kabbalah. Most people sort of miss this completely. Many people, including the great Yitzhak Ber, who wrote the History of the Jews of Spain, commented that philosophy was one of the elements that undermined the fabric of Jewish theology among the masses, and that philosophical speculation eventually caused many Jews to sort of question the veracity of the biblical tradition, of the efficacy of living for one's faith, and perhaps dying for one's faith when that was necessary. And this has sort of been a popular view because the idea is that if Aristotelianism and Platonic thinking, so forth, are sort of absorbed into Jewish communities, there would be a natural questioning of the Jewish tradition, the authenticity of the Torah, the validity of rabbinic law, all these different things. But I think in some sense that's probably very much overstated. And what we find are specific cases in the medieval period and later on where we have individuals who convert, and the reason that they give for their conversions is that it was the influence of Kabbalah. And what do I mean by that? Well, I have another book that I just wrote on a completely different topic about Jewish and Christian interfaith dialogue. And in it, I discuss some of the issues of controversy that exist between Christian conceptions of the Godhead or of God, in the form of Trinitarian thought, and something which, of course, has been pointed out by many people before, although it's typically used in by missionary organizations and those type of things to promulgate their missionary perspectives, and that's the similarities, at least on a surface level, of the Sefirot. And then my point is not to get into discussions about that. It's simply from a historical perspective to understand that there were people who believed that the Sephirotic imagery in Kabbalah was in some sense reflective of the complexity of God. And however they interpreted that, rightly, wrongly, doesn't matter, there was something that they considered to be a point of connection. And in the book that I wrote called Divine Fragmentation, I mentioned that this issue was of great controversy. We don't think about that in the 21st century because we see Kabbalah as sort of a natural part of Jewish theology. There are many facets of it that are very popular. But the reality is that things, just like the Rambam's writings, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon's own Moreh Nevuchim and the philosophical tradition that he embraced, became controversial. The Maimonidean controversy was a point of major contention between Jews in the Iberian Peninsula and Jews in parts of the Iberian Peninsula, like in Barcelona and so forth, but also into France. There was a great controversy there because they felt that he had gone too far, if you will. Well, in the same sense, the issue of Kabbalah was also complicated. And I think that the argument that Rabbi Josef Aur lays out in his book, if I can remember it, because I always forget it, I think it's called At the Dawn of Modernity or something like that, Jews and Conversos. I've got the title wrong. You'll have to forgive me. But if you look up José Faur, F-A-U-R, it's an excellent book, and yet I always forget the title. One of the things that he argues is that the rise of Kabbalah in the medieval period shifted the perspectives of the Jewish community theologically. And in his perspective, and it may be overdone, it can certainly be critiqued, this influence and this adoption of the mystical in many ways overrode the importance of halakha for many. And one key aspect that we have to take into account is that some aspects of Kabbalah embrace the notion of Gilgul, of reincarnation. And so what happens here? Well, if an individual believes in reincarnation, there's always an opportunity for a redo, if you will. And we see this controversy actually later on in the what I would call the reconstituted Jewish community of former conversos in Amsterdam in the 17th century. You have a group of individuals who escaped the Iberian Peninsula, the late 1500s into the 1600s. They merge, or they travel to Amsterdam, where they merge these three different communities, and they're all from a Spanish and Portuguese background. Although we call it the Portuguese Congregation of Amsterdam, but there's reasons for that as well. But one of the controversies that arises is this issue of Gilgul and, believe it or not, eternal damnation. Now, most people think like that's a very Christian concept, and in many ways, there's certainly an influence of that in the Amsterdam community. As you can imagine, these former conversos are reintegrating into the Jewish community, but there's also a legitimate stream of Jewish thought that embraces the notion of Gehinam or Gehonim or Gehenna, different pronunciations of the eternality of that, because most people think about it as only a temporary, period. And there's sources for that as well. But there was one stream of thought that was in effect, or that does exist, that saw punishment can be eternal. And so there was this conflict that existed because some conversos did not want to return to Judaism openly or even at all. They just wanted to live out their, I guess you could say, secular lives, their assimilated lives. And there were rabbis like Isaac Aboab who said, there's opportunities there for them to come back, even if it's through the various transmigrations, the reincarnations, and so forth. And there were rabbis like Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera who said, no, if you don't get right, if you don't get out of Spain or Portugal, if you don't take the step to leave, there will be consequences, and those consequences can be eternal, if you will, eternal damnation. Of course, that's a different topic, which I'm getting off into. But so we have a theological issue. We have the issue of taqiyya. We also have issues of leadership within the Jewish community. Many rabbis, converted. I wouldn't say it's a huge number, but you had significant figures that did. And I think one of the things that you have to think about is that when you have leaders giving in to persecution, that sends shock waves throughout many communities. Now, again, we're not there in the midst of the violence to, I think, if you will, to judge, if you will, the specific circumstances. But the fact, if you have a leadership that is willing to do that, or if you find yourself in a situation where you have family members that you want to save, all those kinds of things have to be taken into consideration. And I think painting this picture of, it was very simple, you just simply lay down your life and that's the end of it. I think it's in some sense it's very naive. I think it's judgmental, and I don't think it's realistic, because I think as we find in the case of the pogroms in the Rhineland, there were cases of crypto-Judaism. The situation was more complex than we imagine. And in those lands, there was a glorification of martyrdom as the ideal. But I think history can sort of reveal that, those communities, those Jewish communities, were reconstituted. Now, part of that may have come in from people coming in from different places, but I think part of it is also people sort of returning to the Jewish community, periods where there may have been a little bit more safety and leaving their conversions and then rejoining the Jewish community in some form or fashion. But whatever the case, it's a very complicated picture. And the goal of this book is to treat that question and to explore it. Because I think in many ways, many people who have looked at Iberian Jewish history have felt that, that Jews in Spain, that Sephardic Jews were not as committed to Judaism. And I sort of in many ways take the opposite view. The fact that you have individuals who, after generations, returned to Judaism, who were able to keep some semblance of identity alive, I think that speaks volumes to the importance that they placed on Jewish identity, even though, of course, in the latter part of the 15th century, the Inquisition was a force to be reckoned with. And although there's a lot of historical revisionism today regarding the exact numbers of who were killed or not, I mean, the fact remains that thousands of individuals were prosecuted, people were imprisoned, people were tortured, and yes, we can sort of debate exactly how many people were burned at the stake. But the purpose of the Inquisition was to draw these people in and to eliminate Judaizing. And I think the notion that Judaizing was, fictitious is absolutely ridiculous. We can talk about the specific elements of it, but I think that the fact that these individuals were able to keep an identity for such a long period of time and return to the Jewish community in some form or fashion testifies to the importance that many families held Judaism in their lives to be. In any case, you can check this out on Amazon. Again, why did Spanish Jews convert to Christianity? And my name, for those of you who don't know, it's Juan Marcos Berjuana Gutierrez. The subtitle here is How Iberian Jews Responded to Persecution. Again, it's available in Kindle form. It's a short book. I think I've sort of found that a lot of these shorter books of about 100 pages are easily digestible by most people, and yet there's sufficient, documentation that's provided to give somebody the ability to, continue their studies. So please check it out, and I'm going to keep doing videos to sort of highlight some of the work that I've done. Leave comments, ask questions. Check out my website, cryptojewesheducation.com, and also my new website. It's called modern-scribe.com. That's my author website. Crypto Jewish Education is specifically focused in on Sephardic issues, more specifically the Sephardic experience in Spain as it relates to Anusim, to Conversos, Crypto Jews, etc. And I'll hope to see you there or in these videos.